Millionaire hires a maid, then falls in love. What he does next shocks everyone. Ethan Turner stared at the empty chair across the dining table, his hands clutching a glass of whiskey. The room, though grand and adorned with lavish chandeliers, felt suffocatingly quiet. It had been like this for months, no years, since Margaret's passing. She had been the light of the mansion, the heart of every room. Now, despite its beauty, the house seemed more like a museum of memories, each corner echoing her laughter that had long faded. He took a sip, the amber liquid burning his throat, but it did little to warm the cold hollowness within him. The staff moved around quietly, avoiding his gaze. They were used to this ritual, Ethan sitting alone, consumed by his thoughts, barely noticing the world around him. In the past, this room had hosted grand dinners and lively conversations. Now it was just a lonely man and his silent regrets. "Mr. Turner?" A soft voice broke the silence. Ethan glanced up, his steely gray eyes meeting his butler's hesitant expression. "The new maid has arrived." Ethan nodded without much interest. "Show her to her quarters and let her know the rules," he said curtly. "Of course, sir," the butler replied, bowing slightly before leaving the room. Downstairs, Sarah Jenkins stood nervously near the front door, clutching her worn leather bag. The sheer grandeur of the mansion overwhelmed her. She had never stepped foot in a place like this. Her life had been filled with small, cramped apartments and endless shifts at low-paying jobs. This job, though daunting, was her only hope of keeping her younger brother Tim in school. His future depended on her perseverance. "Miss Jenkins?" the butler called, drawing her out of her thoughts. "This way, please." Sarah followed him down a long corridor, the polished wooden floors gleaming under the soft glow of antique sconces. Every detail of the house screamed wealth, gold-framed paintings, ornate furniture, and intricate carpets that looked far too expensive to walk on. Yet, despite the splendor, there was a somberness that hung in the air, as if the house itself carried the weight of its owner's grief. "This will be your room," the butler said, opening a door at the end of the hallway. The room was small but comfortable, with a neatly made bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the gardens. "You'll start tomorrow at 6 sharp. Mr. Turner prefers his privacy, so keep your interactions minimal unless instructed otherwise." Sarah nodded, placing her bag on the bed. "Understood." The butler paused, his expression softening slightly. "One more thing. Don't take it personally if Mr. Turner seems distant. He's been through a lot." Sarah offered a polite smile, though she didn't press for details. It wasn't her place to pry. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. She quickly dressed in the uniform provided, a simple black dress with a white apron, and tied her hair back into a neat bun. Her first task was to clean the dining room, and as she entered she found Ethan sitting at the same spot as the night before, a cup of coffee in hand and papers spread across the table. She worked quietly, wiping down the polished surface and arranging the chairs. Ethan didn't acknowledge her presence, his focus entirely on the documents before him. It was only when she accidentally bumped a chair, causing it to scrape against the floor, that he looked up. "Be careful," he said sharply, his tone colder than the winter breeze. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the slight tremble in her hands. She quickly resumed her work, determined not to let his demeanor rattle her. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah settled into her routine. She cleaned the grand halls, polished the silverware, and tended to the garden that had once been Margaret's pride and joy. Though she rarely saw Ethan, she often felt his presence, a shadow moving through the house, lost in his own world. One afternoon, while trimming the roses in the garden, Sarah noticed Ethan standing by the window watching her. He held a book in his hand, but his gaze was fixed on her as if trying to decipher something. Sarah pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the flowers. Inside, Ethan felt a pang of curiosity. There was something different about her, an air of quiet resilience that intrigued him. Most of the staff went about their duties mechanically, but Sarah worked with a kind of purpose, as if each task mattered. He shook his head, brushing off the thought. She was just a maid after all. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the kitchen after finishing her duties, she heard the faint sound of piano music echoing through the halls. Drawn by the melody, she followed it to the music room, where she found Ethan seated at the grand piano, his fingers gliding over the keys. It was a hauntingly beautiful tune, filled with emotion. She stood at the doorway, captivated. The Ethan she saw now was different from the stern man she had encountered before. Here he seemed vulnerable, his pain laid bare in the music. Ethan glanced up, noticing her for the first time. He stopped playing abruptly, his expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner," Sarah stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude. The music, it was beautiful." Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. "It's nothing," he said gruffly, closing the piano lid. "You should get back to your quarters?" Sarah nodded, retreating quickly. But as she walked back to her room, the melody lingered in her mind, a glimpse into the man behind the cold exterior. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah grew accustomed to the routines of the house. Despite its grandeur, the mansion held an emptiness that weighed heavily on her. The other staff spoke in hushed tones about Mr. Turner's past, dropping hints about his late wife, but no one dared to share too much. Sarah didn't pry, though her curiosity grew with each passing day. Ethan, for his part, remained distant. He would occasionally pass Sarah in the halls or catch her tending to the garden, but their exchanges were brief. He was polite but curt, his words never lingering beyond what was necessary. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, observing her from the shadows of the house. One evening, as Sarah was dusting the bookshelves in the library, she came across a photograph tucked between two volumes. It was a picture of a younger Ethan, smiling warmly, his arm around a woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. Sarah studied the photo for a moment, noting the love that seemed to emanate from it. "You're holding a memory," came Ethan's voice from behind her. Startled, Sarah quickly set the photo back on the shelf and turned to face him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he interrupted, his tone softer than she expected. He stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the photo. "That was Margaret." Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should respond. Ethan's expression was distant, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and longing. "She must have been a wonderful person," Sarah said gently. "She was," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She had a way of making everything seem brighter. This house, it was alive when she was here." For a moment the room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Sarah wanted to say something comforting, but she knew that no words could ease the pain he carried. "I should get back to work," she said quietly, stepping away from the shelf. Ethan nodded, though he didn't move. As Sarah left the library, she glanced back to see him still standing there, his hand resting on the photo, lost in memories. The next morning, Sarah found herself assigned to clean the music room. The grand piano stood in the center, its surface gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, remembering the haunting melody Ethan had played that night. She couldn't help but press a single note, the sound echoing softly through the room. "Do you play?" Ethan's voice startled her, and she turned quickly to see him standing in the doorway. "No, not really," Sarah admitted. "I've always loved music, but I never had the chance to learn." Ethan stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on the piano. "It's been a while since I've played for anyone." "You're very talented," Sarah said, her voice sincere. "The other night the piece you played, it was beautiful." Ethan looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "It was Margaret's favorite," he said after a pause. "She always asked me to play it for her." Sarah smiled gently. "You should play more often. It's a gift, and it's clear how much it means to you." For a moment Ethan seemed to consider her words. Then, without saying anything, he sat at the piano and began to play. The notes filled the room, the melody rich with emotion. Sarah stood quietly, watching as Ethan poured his soul into the music. It was as if he was speaking through the keys, sharing a part of himself he rarely showed. When he finished, the silence that followed was profound. Sarah felt a lump in her throat, the beauty of the performance leaving her speechless. "Thank you," she said finally. "That was incredible." Ethan glanced at her, his expression softer than usual. It's been a long time since anyone truly listened. From that day on, a subtle shift began to take place. Ethan's walls, though still firmly in place, seemed to have cracks forming. He began to acknowledge Sarah more, offering small nods of approval or brief words of thanks. For Sarah, these moments, though fleeting, felt significant. She saw glimpses of the man Ethan had once been, buried beneath layers of grief and guardedness. One evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the garden after finishing her tasks, she found Ethan standing by the roses she had recently pruned. He was holding a single bloom, his gaze thoughtful. "They're thriving," he said without looking at her. "Margaret would have loved to see this." Sarah joined him, her hands brushing against the leaves as she adjusted a branch. "She must have had a beautiful vision for this place." "She did," Ethan said. "She loved the garden. She always said it was a reflection of life, fragile yet resilient." "That's a lovely sentiment," Sarah replied. "It's clear she poured a lot of love into it." Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You've done a wonderful job bringing it back to life." Sarah felt a warmth in her chest at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. It means a lot to hear that." As they stood in the fading light, surrounded by the soft fragrance of the roses, Sarah felt a connection forming between them. It was tentative, unspoken, but it was there, a fragile thread of understanding that neither dared to acknowledge outright. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and Sarah's interactions became more frequent. Though their conversations were often brief, they were meaningful. Ethan found himself lingering in the places Sarah worked, drawn to her quiet strength and the way she approached each task with care. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met, humble, kind, and unyieldingly resilient. Sarah, in turn, began to see a side of Ethan that few others did. Beneath his stoic exterior lay a man deeply wounded by loss but searching, even if unknowingly, for something to rekindle his sense of purpose. She admired his vulnerability, even when it was hidden behind sharp words or moments of silence. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah was kneeling in the garden, her hands covered in soil as she worked to plant new bulbs for the next spring. Ethan appeared unexpectedly, holding 2 cups of coffee. He extended one toward her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You've been out here for hours," he said. "I figured you could use a break." Sarah looked up, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said, wiping her hands on her apron before taking the cup. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her fingers and chest. "It's beautiful out here today." Ethan nodded, sitting down on the stone bench nearby. He watched her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, Margaret used to spend entire days out here just like you." Sarah glanced at him, unsure how to respond. She sensed that this wasn't just a casual comment, it was a window into his heart. "She sounds like she was an incredible person," Sarah said softly. "She was," Ethan replied. "She had a way of bringing life to everything she touched. This house, this garden, they've all felt empty since she's been gone." Sarah hesitated, then placed her cup on the ground and sat beside him. "It's not easy to move forward after losing someone you love," she said gently. "But I think Margaret would be proud to see you keeping her memory alive, even in small ways." Ethan was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been doing the opposite, letting the grief consume me, shutting the world out." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Maybe you just needed time to figure out what's next. Everyone heals at their own pace." Ethan looked away, his expression unreadable. "You speak as though you know something about loss." Sarah hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "I've had my share of challenges," she admitted. "When my parents passed away, it was just me and my brother, Tim. I had to grow up fast, take on responsibilities I wasn't ready for. But I learned that life doesn't stop, no matter how much we want it to." Ethan studied her, his gaze softening. "And now you're here, working in a house that probably feels like a world apart from the one you grew up in?" She smiled faintly. "It's different, but it's a job I'm grateful for. And it's given me the chance to do what I need to for Tim. That's what matters most." Ethan leaned back, his coffee forgotten. "You remind me of Margaret in some ways," he said, almost to himself. "She had that same determination, that same refusal to give up, no matter the odds." Sarah felt a warmth rise to her cheeks. "That's a generous comparison. I'm just doing what anyone would." "Not anyone," Ethan said firmly. "It takes strength to keep going when life keeps throwing obstacles in your path." Their conversation lingered in the back of Sarah's mind long after Ethan returned to the house. For the first time, she felt as though she had seen a glimpse of the man Ethan used to be before tragedy hardened him. She couldn't help but wonder if perhaps she was helping him rediscover that part of himself. That evening, Ethan found himself pacing the library, restless. His conversation with Sarah had stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't deny the growing respect and admiration he had for her. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. But hope was a fragile thing, and Ethan was wary of allowing himself to feel it too deeply. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down by the fire, his thoughts racing. Margaret had always told him that love wasn't just about grand gestures or fleeting passions. It was about seeing someone for who they truly were and choosing to stand by them, flaws and all. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Ethan's mind drifted back to Sarah, her quiet resilience, her unwavering kindness. He couldn't ignore the impact she was having on his life, but the thought of opening his heart again terrified him. Meanwhile, in her small room, Sarah sat at her desk, writing a letter to Tim. She detailed her days at the mansion, the people she worked with, and the moments she spent in the garden. But as she wrote, she found herself thinking of Ethan. his guarded demeanor, his rare but meaningful smiles, and the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. For the first time since taking the job, she wondered if she was doing more than just cleaning a house. Perhaps, in her own small way, she was helping to heal a man who had long forgotten how to let others in. The following days brought an unexpected shift in the atmosphere of the house. Ethan began seeking out Sarah's company more frequently, under the guise of casual observations or simple questions about her work. Though he never explicitly acknowledged it, there was a warmth in his presence that hadn't been there before, a subtle, tentative connection forming between them. One morning, as Sarah was arranging fresh flowers in a vase in the dining room, Ethan entered. He carried an air of uncertainty, as if he'd been debating something before finally deciding to approach her. "You seem to know your way around a garden," he said, his voice lighter than usual. Sarah glanced up, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's always been a bit of a refuge for me. There's something calming about tending to plants. They don't ask for much, just care and patience." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Margaret used to say the same thing. She called it her therapy. Sarah placed the last flower in the vase and turned to face him. Maybe she was onto something. It's hard to feel weighed down when you're surrounded by so much life. Ethan nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "Would you mind showing me what you've done out there?" he asked, almost hesitantly. Surprised, Sarah agreed. She led him to the garden, pointing out the changes she'd made, the newly planted bulbs, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the vibrant blooms that now filled the once neglected space. Ethan listened attentively, his usual stoicism softening as he absorbed her words. "I never thought I'd see this place come alive again," he admitted quietly. "You've done more than just maintain it. You've brought back something I thought I'd lost." Sarah felt a flutter in her chest at his words. "I'm glad it means something to you. It's a special place." Ethan's gaze lingered on her, a mix of gratitude and something deeper flickering in his eyes. For a brief moment, the distance he usually kept between himself and others seemed to dissolve. As their time in the garden grew more frequent, so did their conversations. Ethan began opening up about his past, sharing stories of his life with Margaret and the dreams they'd once had for the house. Sarah listened with quiet empathy, offering her thoughts only when it felt right. Her presence was a balm for Ethan, though he didn't fully understand why. One evening, as they walked back toward the house after spending an hour discussing the latest blooms, Ethan stopped abruptly. "Sarah," he began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've spent years shutting people out, convincing myself that it was easier that way. But lately, I've realized that maybe I've been wrong." Sarah turned to him, her expression gentle but curious. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You've reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten. What it feels like to connect with someone. To care." Her breath caught at his words, her cheeks warming. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ethan said quickly, his gaze earnest. "I just wanted you to know. You've made a difference, Sarah. More than you realize." Sarah felt a swell of emotion at his confession, but she pushed it down, unsure of how to respond. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. That means a lot." He smiled faintly, the vulnerability in his expression making her heart ache. "Call me Ethan." From that moment, something shifted between them. The boundaries that had once defined their roles began to blur, replaced by a growing sense of mutual respect and understanding. Ethan found himself seeking Sarah's perspective on things he would have once dismissed, while Sarah discovered a depth to Ethan that few others had been allowed to see. One night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit garden. She couldn't deny the feelings that were beginning to take root within her. Ethan Turner, the guarded, grieving millionaire, was no longer just her employer. He was a man who had opened his heart, even if just a little, and shown her a kindness she hadn't expected. But along with those feelings came doubts. Their lives were worlds apart. Ethan belonged to a realm of wealth and influence, while Sarah's life was grounded in hard work and modest means. Could there ever truly be a place for her in his world? The next morning, Ethan invited Sarah to join him for breakfast in the dining room, a rare and unexpected gesture. The table, usually reserved for grand occasions, was set simply with fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee. Sarah hesitated at first, unsure if she should accept, but Ethan's warm smile reassured her. "I thought it might be nice to have some company for once," he said as she took a seat across from him. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "This is lovely." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the tension that had once marked their interactions now replaced by an easy familiarity. Ethan surprised her by asking about her family, and Sarah shared stories about her brother Tim and the challenges they'd faced together. "He's lucky to have you," Ethan said, his tone sincere. "Not everyone would sacrifice so much for someone else." Sarah shrugged, a faint smile on her lips. "It's what family does. You don't give up on the people you love." Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose that's something I've forgotten along the way." Sarah glanced at him, her heart aching at the hint of regret in his voice. "It's never too late to remember." As the days went on, their bond continued to deepen. Ethan found himself smiling more often, the weight of his grief lifting ever so slightly. Sarah, in turn, felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. The mansion, once a place of formality and distance, began to feel like a home, not just for Ethan but for her as well. But life, as always, had a way of testing even the strongest connections. And neither Ethan nor Sarah could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead. The change in their dynamic did not go unnoticed. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, their hushed conversations carrying a mix of curiosity and judgment. Sarah tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her work and her growing friendship with Ethan. Yet, the weight of those unspoken words lingered, an invisible boundary between her and the rest of the household. Ethan too was aware of the shift. He could sense the subtle glances, the way conversations would stop when he entered a room. It didn't bother him. He had long stopped caring about the opinions of others, but he worried about the toll it might take on Sarah. One afternoon, as Sarah was arranging a bouquet in the foyer, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Finch, the head housekeeper. The older woman's expression was stern, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Jenkins," Mrs. Finch began, her tone clipped. "A word if you don't mind." Sarah straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "Of course, Mrs. Finch." The housekeeper stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I've noticed your interactions with Mr. Turner. I would advise caution. It's not your place to involve yourself in his personal affairs." Sarah's cheeks flushed, both with embarrassment and frustration. "I assure you, Mrs. Finch, I've done nothing inappropriate. Mr. Turner and I simply talk from time to time." Mrs. Finch's lips tightened. "Be that as it may, you do well to remember your role here. The lines between employer and staff exist for a reason." With that, the housekeeper turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the foyer. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew Mrs. Finch's words weren't entirely unwarranted, but they stung nonetheless. It wasn't as if she had planned for her relationship with Ethan to evolve the way it had. And yet, it had, leaving her in a space that felt both exhilarating and precarious. That evening, as Sarah was finishing her duties in the kitchen, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He leaned casually against the frame, his expression lighter than usual. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the clock. "Of course." He gestured for her to follow, leading her out to the garden. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. They walked in silence for a while, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound. Finally, Ethan stopped near the rose bushes and turned to face her. "I've noticed the way the staff looks at you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I know Mrs. Finch spoke to you." Sarah looked down, her hands twisting nervously. "It's nothing I can't handle, Mr. Turner." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "And it's not nothing. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable here." She met his gaze, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his expression. "I appreciate that, but it's part of the job, isn't it? People will always have opinions." "They don't know you like I do," he said, his voice softening. "They don't see the person who's brought life back to this house, who's reminded me what it means to care again." Sarah's breath caught at his words, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan, He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You've changed everything, Sarah. I don't know how else to say it." For a moment the world seemed to still. Sarah felt the weight of his words, the depth of emotion behind them. She wanted to respond, to tell him how much he meant to her, but doubt crept in, a quiet whisper reminding her of the obstacles between them. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice trembling. "We come from such different worlds. Whatever this is, it's not as simple as you make it sound." He frowned, his brows knitting together. "I don't care about the world, Sarah. I care about you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to hold them back. "And what happens when people start to care about what they see? When they start judging you, questioning you? I can handle their stares and their whispers, but I don't want to be the reason you're dragged down." Ethan reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "You're not dragging me down. You're lifting me up." The honesty in his voice broke through her defenses, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. She wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into this fragile, beautiful thing they were building. But her fears were not so easily silenced. "I need time," she whispered. "Time to figure out if I can be brave enough for this." Ethan nodded, his expression a mixture of understanding and pain. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As they stood there in the fading light, the distance between them felt both infinite and impossibly small. They were two people bound by circumstances that should have kept them apart, yet drawn together by something neither could fully explain. The following days were marked by an unspoken tension. Ethan gave Sarah the space she needed, though it was clear that the distance pained him. Sarah, meanwhile, wrestled with her thoughts, torn between the depth of her feelings and the enormity of what they meant. One evening, as she sat by the window in her small room, Sarah watched the moonlight cast a gentle glow over the garden. She thought of Ethan, his kindness, his vulnerability, the way he had slowly opened his heart to her. And she realized that, despite her fears, she couldn't deny the truth. She cared for him deeply. Perhaps more than she had ever thought possible. Sarah awoke the next morning with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. Yet, clarity didn't erase the lingering unease. Her mind raced with questions she didn't have the answers to. What would a life with Ethan look like? Could she withstand the scrutiny that was sure to follow? And more importantly, would she risk losing herself in a world that had always seemed so far beyond her reach? She shook the thoughts away, determined to focus on the present. There were tasks to complete, and dwelling on the unknown wouldn't make the answers come any faster. As she entered the dining room to set up for breakfast, she found Ethan already there, standing by the window. The soft morning light outlined his figure, and for a moment Sarah paused, caught by the sight of him. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the garden below. "Good morning," she said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan turned, his expression brightening slightly. "Good morning, Sarah." She busied herself arranging the silverware, her movements careful and deliberate. She could feel his eyes on her, and the weight of the unspoken tension between them made the room feel smaller than it was. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his voice measured. "About what you said the other night?" Sarah froze for a moment before continuing her task. "Ethan, Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "You were right. This isn't simple. It's not easy. But nothing worth having ever is." She straightened, her eyes meeting his. "I don't want to complicate your life. You've already been through so much. And yet, since you came into my life, I've felt more alive than I have in years," Ethan said, his tone unwavering. "You've reminded me that there's more to life than grief and regret. That there's still beauty to be found, even in the darkest places." Sarah felt her resolve wavering, the sincerity in his words breaking through the walls she tried to build. "Ethan, I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for. You've already given me more than you realize," he replied. "All I'm asking is a chance." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Mrs. Finch entered the room, her sharp eyes darting between them. The tension was palpable, and Sarah quickly busied herself with the table, avoiding the housekeeper's gaze. "Breakfast is ready, Mr. Turner," Mrs. Finch announced, her tone clipped. "Shall I bring it in?" Ethan glanced at Sarah, then back at Mrs. Finch. "Yes, thank you." As the housekeeper disappeared into the kitchen, Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She needed space to think, to process everything that was happening. But in the quiet moments that followed, she realized that avoiding the truth would only make things harder. The day passed slowly, each task feeling heavier than usual. Sarah found herself retreating to the garden, seeking solace among the flowers she had worked so hard to nurture. She knelt by the roses, her fingers brushing gently against the petals. The garden had become her sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world seemed to fade. She didn't hear Ethan approach until his shadow fell over her. Startled, she looked up to find him standing there, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "I needed some air," Sarah replied, turning back to the roses. Ethan crouched beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "Sarah, I don't want to pressure you. I just want you to know that I'm here no matter what you decide." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Sarah's heart ache. She looked at him, searching for the right words but found none. Instead, she nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Ethan reached out, his hand lightly brushing hers. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative thing, but hope nonetheless. The following weeks brought a strange sense of normalcy, though the unspoken connection between them lingered. Ethan continued to find ways to be near Sarah, whether it was offering to help in the garden or asking for her opinion on minor details around the house. Sarah, in turn, found herself opening up to him more, sharing stories of her childhood and the dreams she had once dared to hold. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a warm, golden light, Ethan appeared at Sarah's door. He held a small envelope in his hand, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to show you something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Sarah hesitated for a moment before nodding. She followed him through the house, her curiosity growing with each step. He led her to the library where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. On the table in the center of the room lay a set of blueprints, the edges worn and faded. "What's this?" Sarah asked, stepping closer. Ethan gestured toward the plans. "It's a project Margaret and I dreamed of. A community center, meant to provide resources and opportunities for people who need them most. We started working on it years ago, but after she passed, I couldn't bring myself to finish it." Sarah looked at the blueprints, her heart swelling with a mix of admiration and sadness. "It's a beautiful idea. I want to finish it," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And I want you to help me." Sarah blinked, taken aback. "Me? You have a way of seeing the world that I've lost," Ethan said. "Your perspective, your kindness, it's exactly what this project needs." She felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Ethan, I don't know if I'm qualified to." "You're more than qualified," he interrupted. "I trust you, Sarah. And I believe in what we can accomplish together." The sincerity in his voice left her speechless. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of a future, one where their connection could become something greater than either of them had imagined. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "That's all I ask." As the firelight danced across the room, Sarah felt the weight of possibility settle over her. This was more than a project. It was a chance to build something meaningful, to bridge the gap between their worlds. And perhaps, it was the beginning of a story neither of them had expected. The days following their conversation were filled with planning and brainstorming. Ethan's excitement for the community center grew with each passing moment, and Sarah found herself swept up in his enthusiasm. The blueprints became a regular sight on the library table, joined by notebooks filled with ideas, lists of potential partnerships, and rough sketches of what the finished project might look like. For Sarah, it was both thrilling and daunting. She had never been part of something so significant before, and the weight of responsibility was not lost on her. But Ethan's unwavering confidence in her bolstered her resolve. If he believed in her, maybe she could learn to believe in herself. One afternoon, they sat side by side at the library table, reviewing a list of potential locations for the center. Ethan leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully against his lip. "This one looks promising," he said, pointing to a plot of land on the edge of the city. "It's close to public transportation and has enough space for everything we're planning." Sarah leaned over to look, her brow furrowed. "But it's in an industrial area. Do you think people would feel comfortable coming there?" Ethan considered her point, nodding slowly. "You're right. We need a location that feels welcoming, like a true community space." They fell into a rhythm, bouncing ideas off each other, their conversation flowing easily. Sarah marveled at how natural it felt to work with Ethan, as if they had been doing this for years. Despite their differences, they complemented each other in ways she hadn't anticipated. As they worked, the door to the library creaked open and Mrs. Finch appeared. Her expression was tight, her disapproval palpable. Sarah tensed, but Ethan, oblivious or indifferent, gestured for the housekeeper to speak. "Mr. Turner," Mrs. Finch began, her tone clipped, "the staff has been asking questions about the changes in the household." Ethan arched a brow. "What changes?" Mrs. Finch's gaze flicked briefly to Sarah before returning to Ethan. "Your increased interaction with Miss Jenkins has not gone unnoticed. There are concerns about propriety." Sarah's face flushed, her heart pounding. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan spoke first. "Let me make one thing clear, Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What I choose to do and with whom is my business. If the staff has concerns, they can bring them to me directly." Mrs. Finch stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Of course, Mr. Turner. I only wish to ensure the household runs smoothly." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "It will. Thank you, Mrs. Finch." The housekeeper hesitated for a moment longer before nodding curtly and leaving the room. The door closed with a soft click, and silence settled over the library. I'm sorry, Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with guilt. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Ethan turned to her, his expression softening. You haven't caused trouble, Sarah. People will always talk. Let them. She nodded, though the unease lingered. Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of reassurance. We're doing something important here. Don't let their whispers distract you. His words, spoken with such conviction, steadied her nerves. She gave him a small smile and they returned to their work, the tension slowly dissipating. As the weeks turned into months, progress on the community center began to take shape. Ethan and Sarah toured potential sites, met with architects, and reached out to local organizations for support. The project consumed their days, but it also brought them closer, their shared vision deepening their bond. One crisp winter morning, Sarah stood in the garden, her breath visible in the chilly air. She was inspecting the dormant rose bushes, mentally planning for the spring, when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Ethan approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. I thought I might find you here, he said with a smile. It's my favorite spot, Sarah admitted. Even in the winter it feels alive. Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the frost-covered blooms. It reminds me of you, he said softly. You bring life to the most unexpected places. Sarah's cheeks warmed, but she met his eyes, her heart pounding. Ethan? He stepped closer, his expression earnest. I know this isn't easy. And I know there's still a part of you that wonders if we can make this work. But I want you to know that I'm all in, Sarah. Whatever it takes, I'm willing to fight for this. For us. Tears pricked at her eyes and she looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Ethan, I'm scared. I don't want to let you down. You won't, he said firmly. You've already given me more than I ever thought possible. You've made me believe in a future I didn't think I deserved. His words broke through her hesitation and she turned back to him, her eyes glistening. I care about you, Ethan. More than I ever thought I could. But this isn't just about us. It's about everything, our worlds, the expectations, the people who don't want to see this happen. Ethan reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. Let them talk. Let them judge. None of it matters as long as we know what's real. For a moment, they stood there in the garden, the cold air forgotten as they gazed at each other. Then, slowly, Sarah leaned into him, their foreheads touching as the weight of their unspoken feelings finally found release. I'm all in too, she whispered. A smile spread across Ethan's face and he pulled her into an embrace, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. The garden, silent and still, bore witness to a love that had blossomed against all odds. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With Sarah's encouragement and guidance, Ethan finalized the purchase of a location for the community center, a charming but neglected property on the edge of a vibrant neighborhood. The building was old but filled with potential, and its proximity to schools and public spaces made it the perfect choice. The announcement of the project sent ripples through the community, and soon volunteers and local organizations joined the effort. What began as Ethan's quiet tribute to Margaret became a movement, with Sarah at its heart. She worked tirelessly, coordinating meetings, managing schedules, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly alive, driven not by profit or prestige but by purpose. One afternoon, as they stood in the nearly completed building, Ethan watched Sarah oversee a group of volunteers painting the walls. Her laughter echoed through the space, filling it with warmth. He couldn't help but smile, his heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. Sarah, he called, his voice cutting through the chatter. She turned, wiping her hands on her paint-streaked apron. What's up? Come with me for a moment, he said, gesturing toward the front of the building. Curious, she followed him outside, where the winter sun cast a golden glow over the city. Ethan leaned against the railing, his hands resting in his pockets as he looked out over the bustling streets. I've been thinking a lot about everything we've done here, he began, his tone thoughtful. And about how much of it wouldn't have been possible without you. Sarah tilted her head, her expression softening. You give me too much credit. This was your dream, Ethan. I just helped you see it through. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. You did more than that. You reminded me of what it means to live, to hope, to believe in something bigger than myself. You brought me back to life, Sarah. Her breath caught at his words, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan? He reached for her hands, holding them tightly. I know this hasn't been easy and I know the road ahead might still be tough. But I also know that I don't want to face it without you. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she searched his face. Are you sure? This isn't just about us. People will talk and they'll judge. Let them, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. I've spent too much of my life caring about what other people think. What matters to me is you. And the life we can build together. Sarah felt her defenses crumble, the weight of her fears dissolving in the face of his certainty. She smiled through her tears, nodding as she squeezed his hands. I want that too. Ethan's face lit up with a joy she hadn't seen before. He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as if to promise that he would never let go. For a moment, the world around them faded, leaving only the warmth of their connection. The opening of the community center was a resounding success. The building, now vibrant and full of life, stood as a testament to the power of resilience and hope. Families gathered in the main hall, children ran through the corridors, and volunteers greeted visitors with smiles. The air buzzed with excitement and possibility. Ethan stood near the entrance, watching as Sarah spoke with a group of parents about the programs they planned to offer. She radiated confidence and warmth, her presence a beacon for everyone around her. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride, not just in the center but in her. As the evening wore on, Ethan found Sarah by the refreshment table refilling cups of punch. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a smile. Enjoying the party? She teased. More than I expected, he admitted. Though I think it has less to do with the party and more to do with you. Sarah rolled her eyes playfully but her cheeks flushed. You always know what to say. It's the truth, Ethan said, his tone serious. Look around, Sarah. This is what we've built. Together. She followed his gaze, taking in the bustling crowd and the laughter that filled the air. Her chest swelled with a mixture of pride and gratitude. I still can't believe this is real. It's real, Ethan said, reaching for her hand. And it's only the beginning? Sarah looked up at him, her heart full. I wouldn't want to face it with anyone else. Ethan smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. Neither would I. As the night continued, the community center stood as a beacon of hope, not just for the people it served but for Ethan and Sarah as well. It was more than a building. It was a symbol of their journey, their resilience, and the love that had brought them together against all odds. And in that moment, surrounded by the life and energy they had worked so hard to create, Ethan and Sarah knew that their story was far from over. Together they were ready to face whatever came next.